In the grand halls of Valdoria Palace, where golden chandeliers cast dancing shadows on marble floors, a secret festers like a wound that refuses to heal. Captain Marcus Thornfield has served the royal family for 15 years, his sword arm strong and his loyalty absolute. But, tonight, as he stands guard outside young Prince Alexander's chambers, he carries a burden heavier than any armor. The letter in his pocket bears the royal seal, yet its contents would shake the very foundations of the kingdom. 3 words echo in his mind like a death knell: the boy knows. What Marcus discovered in the palace archives 3 days ago was never meant for mortal eyes. A conspiracy so dark, so twisted, that it reaches into the heart of the royal bloodline itself. Now, as footsteps echo in the corridor and shadows move with purpose toward the prince's door, Marcus must choose between his oath to the crown and his duty to an innocent child who sleeps peacefully, unaware that his entire world is built on lies. The clock strikes midnight. In 6 hours, Prince Alexander will wake to find his life forever changed. But, first, Marcus must decide how many people he's willing to kill to keep a 12-year-old boy's innocence intact for just one more night. Some secrets are worth dying for. Others are worth killing for. Tonight, Captain Marcus Thornfield will discover which kind he's been protecting. The rain hammered against the towering windows of Valdoria Palace like angry fists demanding entry. Captain Marcus Thornfield adjusted his grip on his sword hilt as he walked the familiar corridors, his boots echoing against polished marble that had witnessed 3 centuries of royal blood and betrayal. Tonight felt different. Tonight, the very walls seemed to whisper warnings. Marcus had been captain of the Royal Guard for 5 years, but he'd served the crown for 15. He knew every secret passage, every hidden door, every face that belonged within these walls. More importantly, he knew which faces didn't belong. The 3 men who had arrived that afternoon under the guise of diplomatic envoys carried themselves wrong. Their eyes moved too quickly, their hands stayed too close to concealed weapons, and their papers, while bearing authentic seals, felt wrong in ways Marcus couldn't articulate. Prince Alexander slept peacefully in his chambers, unaware that his 12th birthday tomorrow would bring more than just celebration. The boy had grown tall for his age, with the distinctive silver-blue eyes of the Valdorian royal line and an infectious laugh that could brighten even the gloomiest palace day. Marcus had watched him grow from a curious toddler into an intelligent young prince who asked too many questions and noticed too many details for his own good. 3 days ago, while investigating a break-in at the palace archives, Marcus had stumbled upon something that changed everything. Hidden behind a false wall in the oldest section of the library, he'd discovered documents that should have been destroyed decades ago. Birth records, death certificates, and a journal written in the shaking hand of the late Queen Mother, Alexander's grandmother. The words still burned in Marcus's memory like acid. The true heir was switched. Alexander is not Robert's son. The real prince died in infancy, and we replaced him to save the bloodline. Only Marcus Eldridge knew the truth, and we silenced him permanently. Marcus Eldridge had been his grandfather, the previous captain of the Royal Guard who had died in a mysterious hunting accident when Marcus was just 10 years old. Now, 25 years later, Marcus understood that it hadn't been an accident at all. King Robert ruled Valdoria with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove. To the people, he was a benevolent monarch who had brought prosperity and peace. To those within the palace walls, he was a man whose smile never reached his eyes and whose mercy was as rare as winter roses. If the king discovered that Marcus knew the truth about Alexander's parentage, both of their lives would end before dawn. Marcus paused outside Alexander's door, pressing his ear against the wood. The boy's breathing was deep and even, lost in innocent dreams. Tomorrow was supposed to be a day of celebration, with the entire kingdom gathering to honor their young prince's coming of age. Instead, it might be the day everything unraveled. The 3 false diplomats had requested a private audience with King Robert at midnight. Marcus had positioned his most trusted guards strategically throughout the palace, but he knew their loyalty was to the crown, not to the truth. If King Robert ordered Alexander's death, most of the guard would follow that command without question. Down the corridor, a door creaked open. Marcus's hand moved instinctively to his sword as he stepped back into the shadows. A figure emerged from one of the guest chambers, moving with the fluid grace of a trained killer. It was one of the false diplomats, a lean man with scars across his knuckles that spoke of violence as a profession. The man moved toward Alexander's chambers with purpose, but stopped when he noticed Marcus standing guard. For a long moment, they stared at each other in the dim torchlight. The assassin's eyes were cold and calculating, weighing whether he could kill Marcus quickly enough to avoid raising an alarm. "Lost, sir?" Marcus asked quietly, his voice carrying the authority of 15 years protecting royalty. His stance shifted subtly, moving into a position where he could draw his sword and strike in one fluid motion. "Looking for the washroom," the man replied, his accent definitely not from the neighboring kingdom his papers claimed. Eastern valleys, Marcus thought, where they trained killers from childhood and loyalty could be bought with enough gold. "3 doors down, on your left," Marcus said, never taking his eyes off the man. "Though I should mention that the palace guards patrol these halls every 15 minutes. Wouldn't want you to get lost again." The threat was clear. The assassin smiled, but it was the expression of a snake recognizing another predator. He nodded politely and retreated to his chambers, but Marcus knew he'd be back. They all would, once they received word that their target was confirmed. Marcus waited until the corridor was empty before reaching into his coat and pulling out the letter that had arrived just hours ago. The royal seal was authentic, but the message inside had chilled his blood. "Captain Thornfield. Your discretion regarding recent discoveries has been noted. The boy's 13th birthday approaches, and certain arrangements must be made. Report to the Eastern Tower at midnight for further instructions. Your grandfather served faithfully until the end. See that you follow his example. Our King Robert knew." Somehow, despite Marcus's careful investigation, the king had discovered that someone was asking dangerous questions about the past. The reference to his grandfather was unmistakably a threat. Marcus Eldridge had served faithfully until the end, and that end had come at the point of a blade disguised as a hunting accident. Marcus folded the letter and tucked it back into his coat. The Eastern Tower was where the previous kings of Valdoria had once imprisoned their enemies before public executions. It was also where several members of the royal guard had mysteriously disappeared over the years when they'd learned things they weren't supposed to know. A soft sound from Alexander's chamber made Marcus freeze. The boy was talking in his sleep, something he'd done since childhood when he was troubled or excited. Marcus pressed his ear to the door again. "No, I don't want to go," Alexander mumbled, his voice thick with sleep and distress. "Please don't make me leave. This is my home." Even in dreams, the boy seemed to sense that something was wrong. Children had instincts that adults learn to ignore, and Alexander had always been perceptive beyond his years. Just last week, he'd asked Marcus why his father looked at him with such strange expressions sometimes, as if he were seeing someone else entirely. Now Marcus understood. King Robert wasn't looking at his son when he gazed at Alexander. He was looking at a living reminder of his greatest deception, a constant threat to everything he'd built. As long as Alexander lived, there was always the possibility that someone would discover the truth and use it to destroy the kingdom. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the corridor. Marcus stepped away from Alexander's door and assumed his formal guard position, hand resting casually on his sword hilt. 2 of his own men approached, making their scheduled patrol. "Evening, Captain," said Sergeant Blackwood, a grizzled veteran who'd served alongside Marcus for 8 years. "Quiet night?" "Quiet enough," Marcus replied, studying both men carefully. Blackwood had always been reliable, but his companion, Guard Davidson, had only joined the Royal Guard 6 months ago. His background was solid, but Marcus had learned to trust his instincts, and something about Davidson's posture suggested he was listening for more than just conversation. "The king requests that all guard captains report their positions hourly tonight," Davidson said, his eyes never quite meeting Marcus's. "Special security measures for tomorrow's celebration." Marcus nodded slowly. That order hadn't come through the normal channels, which meant King Robert was moving pieces into position without following standard protocol. The king was planning something that required absolute secrecy and plausible deniability. "Of course," Marcus said. "Though I notice our diplomatic guests are still awake. Perhaps additional security for their quarters would be appropriate?" Blackwood frowned. Diplomatic guests? I wasn't informed of any visitors requiring guard detail. Davidson's hand moved slightly toward his sword. I'm sure the captain is mistaken. No diplomatic visitors are scheduled until next week. Marcus smiled, but it was the expression of a wolf showing its teeth. My mistake. Must have been the palace staff I saw. You know how servants can look like anyone in poor light. The tension in the corridor was thick enough to cut with a blade. Davidson knew that Marcus knew, but he couldn't act without revealing himself. Blackwood sensed the undercurrent but couldn't identify its source. Marcus calculated distances and angles, planning which man to kill first if violence erupted. Well, Blackwood said finally, his veteran instincts telling him to retreat from whatever was building between his captain and his fellow guard. We should continue our patrol. Good evening, Captain. As the two men walked away, Marcus heard Davidson whisper something to Blackwood that made the sergeant's shoulders tense. Whatever web of conspiracy King Robert had woven, it extended deeper into the guard than Marcus had realized. The clock in the palace tower chimed 11 times. 1 hour until midnight. 1 hour before Marcus had to choose between following orders that would certainly lead to his death or finding another path that might save both him and Alexander. Marcus pulled out the key to Alexander's chamber and quietly unlocked the door. The boy slept peacefully, his face relaxed and innocent. On his bedside table lay a half-finished letter to his cousin in a neighboring kingdom, describing his excitement about tomorrow's birthday celebration and his hope that his father might finally tell him some of the palace stories he'd been promised for years. Those stories would never be told. At least, not by King Robert. But Marcus had spent 15 years learning every secret the palace walls contained, and he'd discovered that sometimes the most important truths were the ones people die to protect. He closed the door softly and resumed his position. In the distance, thunder rolled across the mountains that surrounded Valdoria, and Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the storm outside was nothing compared to the tempest about to break within the palace walls. The choice was simple, even if the consequences would be anything but. He could report to the Eastern Tower at midnight and hope that King Robert's mercy extended to loyal servants who'd stumbled upon inconvenient truths. Or he could do what his grandfather had been killed for attempting 25 years ago, protect the innocent, regardless of the cost. Marcus thought of his grandfather's journal, hidden behind loose stones in his quarters, filled with observations about palace life and growing suspicions about the royal family's secrets. The last entry, written the day before Marcus Eldridge's death, had contained a single line that haunted Marcus now: some duties transcend loyalty to kings. As the clock tower chimed the quarter hour, Marcus made his choice. He would not report to the Eastern Tower. He would not follow in his grandfather's footsteps by trusting that the truth would protect him. Instead, he would do something no one expected: he would take the initiative. The false diplomats thought they were hunting prey who didn't know they were being hunted. King Robert believed he was manipulating pieces on a board where only he knew all the rules. They were all about to discover that Captain Marcus Thornfield had learned more from his grandfather's death than they realized, and that sometimes the most dangerous man in a palace was the one who had nothing left to lose. Marcus moved through the palace like a ghost, his 15 years of service having taught him every creak in the floorboards and which corridors carried sound farthest. The servants' passages that honeycombed the ancient structure were his highway now, allowing him to observe without being observed. He'd left his post outside Alexander's chamber for the first time in 5 years, but desperate times demanded desperate measures. His first stop was the chamber of Sir Edmund Blackthorne, the king's most trusted advisor and the man who'd been present at every suspicious death in the palace for the past 2 decades. If anyone knew the full scope of King Robert's plans, it would be Blackthorne. The advisor's quarters were on the 3rd floor, in a section of the palace that housed only the most senior members of the royal household. Through the servants' passage, Marcus could hear voices from Blackthorne's study. He pressed his ear to the thin wooden panel and listened carefully. 3 men were speaking in low tones, their words barely audible through the ancient oak. "The boy has grown too curious," came Blackthorne's distinctive voice, refined by years at court but carrying an undertone of steel. "Last week he asked the librarian about birth records. Yesterday he inquired why his eyes are a different shade than his father's." "Children ask questions," replied a voice Marcus recognized as one of the false diplomats.
It means nothing.
This child asks the right questions, Blackthorn continued.
His tutor reports that Alexander has been studying genealogy with unusual intensity. He's mapped the royal bloodline back 6 generations and found inconsistencies.
Marcus's blood ran cold.
Alexander wasn't just an innocent victim, he was actively investigating his own heritage.
The boy's intelligence, which had always been a source of pride for those who taught him, had become a death sentence. Then, we accelerate the timeline, said the third voice, which Marcus now recognized as King Robert himself. The king's presence in a clandestine meeting confirmed Marcus's worst fears. The celebration tomorrow provides perfect cover.
A tragic accident during the festivities.
Perhaps a balcony railing that gives way, or food that disagrees with him.
The captain poses a problem, Blackthorn said.
Marcus Thornfield has been asking his own questions. Our sources indicate he's been in the archives, examining the same records that concerned us 25 years ago. Like grandfather, like grandson, King Robert said with cold amusement. Marcus Eldridge thought he could threaten the stability of the kingdom with his inconvenient discoveries. His grandson seems determined to follow the same path.
The difference, said the false diplomat, is that we're prepared this time.
Captain Thornfield received his invitation to the Eastern Tower. If he's wise, he'll accept his fate quietly.
If not, we have contingencies.
Marcus heard the scrape of chairs as the men stood. The meeting was ending, and he needed to move before they discovered his absence from his post. But, as he turned to leave, Blackthorn's next words froze him in place.
What about the girl? What girl?
King Robert's voice carried sharp interest.
Alexander's cousin, Princess Elena from the northern province.
She arrives tomorrow for the celebration, but she's been corresponding with the boy for months.
Our intercepted letters suggest Alexander has shared some of his genealogical research with her. Marcus's heart sank. Princess Elena was 15, brilliant, and beloved by her people.
If she'd become entangled in Alexander's investigation, her life was now in danger as well. Then, we expand the scope, King Robert said matter-of-factly.
Tragic accidents can claim multiple victims.
A fire in the guest wing, perhaps. These old castles are so prone to such disasters. The casual way the king discussed murdering children made Marcus's hand tighten on his sword hilt. This was no longer about protecting a secret, it was about saving innocent lives from a monster who wore a crown. Marcus retreated through the servants' passage and made his way toward the guest wing where Princess Elena would be staying. If she was arriving tomorrow, her advance guard would already be in position, and Marcus needed to know who he could trust. The guest wing was darker than the main palace, lit only by torches that cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. Marcus found the quarters that had been prepared for Princess Elena and her retinue. 2 guards stood at attention outside her door, but they weren't wearing the uniform of her northern province. Instead, they wore the colors of King Robert's personal guard. The princess was already under surveillance, possibly house arrest disguised as protection. Marcus approached the guards with the confidence of his rank.
Gentlemen,
I wasn't aware the princess had arrived early. She hasn't, replied the taller guard, a man Marcus recognized as one of King Robert's more ruthless enforcers.
We're preparing security measures for tomorrow. I see. And where are her own guards? Protocol requires that visiting royalty maintain their personal protection detail.
The guards exchanged glances.
Delayed by weather, the second man said. They'll arrive with the princess tomorrow.
Marcus nodded, but his mind was racing.
Princess Elena's guards weren't delayed, they'd been intercepted.
The princess would arrive alone, vulnerable, and completely unaware that she was walking into a trap. As Marcus walked away from the guest wing, he began to understand the full scope of King Robert's plan.
Tomorrow's celebration would end with the tragic deaths of Prince Alexander and Princess Elena, eliminating 2 young people who knew too much.
The kingdom would mourn their beloved prince, the northern province would be thrown into chaos by the loss of their heir, and King Robert would emerge as the grieving father who had lost everything. But there were still pieces of the puzzle missing. Why had King Robert allowed Alexander to live for 12 years if the boy's existence was such a threat?
What had changed recently to accelerate the timeline?
Marcus made his way to his own quarters, a modest set of rooms near the guard barracks that had been his home for 15 years. Hidden behind a loose stone near his fireplace was his grandfather's journal, the one record that detailed the original conspiracy. By candlelight, Marcus read his grandfather's careful notes about the night Prince Alexander was supposedly born. According to the official records, Queen Isabella had given birth to a healthy son after a long and difficult labor. But Marcus Eldridge had noted inconsistencies. The Queen had been seen walking in the gardens hours after supposedly giving birth, showing no signs of recent childbirth. The royal physician had left the palace immediately afterward and died in a convenient accident before he could be questioned. Most tellingly, a servant girl had disappeared the same night, along with her newborn son. The real Prince Alexander had died in infancy, probably from natural causes. But, rather than admit the failure and risk a succession crisis, King Robert and his advisors had orchestrated an elaborate deception. They'd taken the servant's healthy baby and declared him the prince, ensuring the royal bloodline would continue. For 12 years, the deception had held. But children grow up, and Alexander had inherited his real mother's intelligence and curiosity. As he matured, he'd begun asking questions that led him closer to the truth. Worse, he'd involved his cousin Elena, creating a web of knowledge that threatened to expose everything. Marcus closed the journal and returned it to its hiding place. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was risking his life to protect a boy who wasn't actually royal blood, while helping to preserve a throne built on lies. But Alexander was innocent of his father's crimes, and, more importantly, he was a good person who deserved to live regardless of his parentage. The clock tower chimed midnight. Marcus should have been at the Eastern Tower, accepting whatever fate King Robert had planned for him. Instead, he was preparing for war. He moved to his weapons chest and began selecting tools for the night ahead. His sword was perfectly balanced, honed to razor sharpness, and had tasted blood in defense of the realm many times. A pair of throwing knives went into his belt, along with a small crossbow that could fire silently. Finally, he pulled on a suit of dark leather armor that would allow him to move silently while providing protection against blade and bolt. As Marcus prepared to leave his quarters, he heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Heavy boots, moving with military precision. They stopped outside his door, and Marcus heard the distinctive sound of weapons being drawn. A voice called out, one he recognized as belonging to Lieutenant Hammond, one of King Robert's most loyal officers. "Captain Thornfield. His Majesty requests your immediate presence in the Eastern Tower." Marcus smiled grimly. King Robert hadn't waited to see if he would obey the summons. The king was taking no chances, sending armed men to escort him to his execution. One moment, Marcus called back, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "I'm not properly dressed to meet His Majesty." He heard Hammond whisper orders to the men with him. They were positioning themselves to prevent his escape, probably expecting him to try to flee through the window. They didn't know about the servant's passage hidden behind his wardrobe. Marcus blew out the candle, plunging the room into darkness. In the sudden blackness, he moved with the silent efficiency of a man whose life depended on not making a sound. The hidden panel opened at his touch, revealing the narrow passage that connected his quarters to the kitchen levels below. As he disappeared into the walls of the palace, Marcus heard Hammond order his men to break down the door. By the time they discovered his escape route, he would be 3 levels away and moving toward his real objective. Alexander was still sleeping peacefully in his chamber, but Marcus knew the boy's time was running out. King Robert would soon discover that his captain had escaped, and the king's patience for subtlety would evaporate. If Alexander couldn't be killed quietly, he would be killed loudly, with whatever justification could be manufactured afterward. Marcus emerged from the servants' passage in the stable complex, where the palace's horses were kept along with the carriages used for royal transport. The stable master, old Henrik, was awake despite the late hour, tending to a mare that was foaling. "Captain?" Henrik looked surprised to see Marcus in armor at midnight. "Is there trouble?" Henrik had worked in the palace for 40 years and had known Marcus since he was a child visiting his grandfather. More importantly, he was one of the few people in the palace who remembered the suspicious circumstances surrounding Marcus Eldridge's death. "The worst kind of trouble," Marcus said quietly.
"Henrik, do you remember what you told me about my grandfather's last night alive?"
The old man's eyes widened with understanding.
"He came here, just like you are now.
Said he had to get someone away from the palace before dawn, or innocent blood would be spilled."
"I need your help," Marcus said. "Prince Alexander's life depends on it." Henrik didn't hesitate. "The fastest horses are in the north stable.
Take Thunder and Lightning, they're bred for distance and speed. There's a cart loaded with supplies for the mountain monasteries. It leaves at dawn, but it could leave earlier if needed."
"What about you? If the king discovers you helped me?"
Henrik smiled, but it was the expression of a man who'd made peace with his choices. "I'm 70 years old, Captain. I've served 3 kings, and I know which ones deserve my loyalty."
"Your grandfather died protecting what was right. If you're following his path, then it's an honor to help." Marcus clasped the old man's shoulder. "If anyone asks, you never saw me tonight." "I've been blind and deaf for years," Henrik replied. Terrible afflictions for a stable master, but convenient for keeping secrets. As Marcus prepared the horses, he heard commotion from the direction of the main palace. Torches were moving across the courtyards, and the sound of armed men shouting orders echoed off the stone walls. King Robert's patience had indeed run out, and the hunt for Marcus Thornfield had begun in earnest. But Marcus had advantages that his enemies didn't expect. He knew the palace better than anyone except perhaps Henrik himself. He understood the mountain paths that led away from Valdoria, having ridden patrol along them for 15 years. Most importantly, he was no longer constrained by loyalty to a king who had proven himself unworthy of such devotion. The clock tower chimed the quarter hour. Dawn was still 5 hours away, but Marcus couldn't wait for Henrik's scheduled departure. He needed to reach Alexander, extract him from the palace, and get him to safety before King Robert's web of assassins closed around them both. As he led the horses through the stable complex toward a side entrance that opened onto the mountain path, Marcus thought about the choice that lay ahead. He could try to expose the truth about Alexander's parentage and King Robert's crimes, but that would require evidence and allies he didn't have. Or he could focus on keeping the boy alive and let the larger questions of justice wait for another day. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made the decision for him. A patrol of the king's personal guard was riding hard toward the stable complex, probably following reports of suspicious activity. Marcus had perhaps 10 minutes before they arrived, barely enough time to reach Alexander's chamber and attempt an extraction. He mounted Thunder and rode toward the palace, no longer concerned with stealth. The time for hiding was over. Now came the part he'd trained for his entire life, fighting impossible odds to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was about to commit treason to save a boy who wasn't actually a prince, in service to ideals of honor that the real king had abandoned long ago. But, as Marcus spurred his horse toward the darkened windows of Alexander's chamber, he knew his grandfather would have understood. Some duties did transcend loyalty to kings, and some innocence was worth any price to preserve. The palace erupted into chaos as Marcus rode Thunder through the main courtyard, his hoofbeats echoing off the stone walls like gunshots in the night. Guards emerged from doorways and alcoves, some confused by the commotion, others moving with the purposeful intent of men following predetermined orders. Marcus had perhaps minutes before the entire palace guard would be mobilized against him. He dismounted near the servants' entrance closest to Alexander's chambers and secured Thunder to a hitching post. The horse was trained for battle and wouldn't flee at the sound of steel, but Marcus hoped he wouldn't need such extreme measures. His plan was simple: wake Alexander, explain just enough to secure his cooperation, and get him out of the palace before King Robert could organize a proper manhunt. The servants' passages were his advantage. While the main corridors would soon be crawling with guards searching for him, the hidden pathways between walls remained largely unknown to all but a few trusted palace staff. Marcus navigated them with the confidence of long familiarity, moving upward through levels of ancient stonework toward the royal quarters. He emerged from a hidden panel near Alexander's chamber to find the corridor strangely quiet.
The two guards who should have been posted outside the prince's door were absent, and the silence felt oppressive rather than peaceful. Marcus drew his sword and approached the heavy wooden door, every instinct screaming that something was wrong. The door was unlocked. In 15 years of guarding the royal family, Marcus had never known Alexander's chamber to be left unsecured at night. He pushed the door open slowly, prepared for an ambush, and stepped into darkness that felt too complete, too absolute. The chamber was empty. Not just vacant, but empty in a way that suggested hasty departure or violent removal. Alexander's bed was unmade, sheets thrown back as if someone had awakened suddenly. His clothes from the previous day lay scattered on the floor, and the window that led to the private balcony stood open, curtains billowing in the night wind. Marcus moved quickly to the window and looked out onto the balcony. No signs of struggle, no blood, no indication that Alexander had been forced from his room by violence. But, on the stone railing, barely visible in the torchlight from the courtyard below, were scratches that looked like fingernail marks, as if someone had gripped the stone desperately while being pulled away. A soft sound from the corridor made Marcus spin around, sword at the ready. A figure in a servant's cloak stood in the doorway, but the posture was wrong for a palace worker. Too straight, too alert, too ready for violence.
"Captain Thornfield," said a young woman's voice, cultured and confident despite the circumstances.
"I was beginning to think you'd abandoned your charge." The figure pushed back her hood, revealing the sharp features and intelligent eyes of Princess Elena of the northern province. She was supposed to arrive the next day for Alexander's birthday celebration, but here she was in the dead of night, dressed as a servant and apparently as aware of the danger as Marcus himself. "Your Highness," Marcus said, lowering his sword but not sheathing it.
"You're early."
"I'm exactly on time," Elena replied, stepping into the chamber and closing the door behind her.
"Alexander sent word 3 days ago that I should arrive secretly.
He said he'd discovered something terrible about his birth and needed my help to verify it." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air.
"Where is the prince now?"
"Gone.
Taken from his room about an hour ago by men I didn't recognize.
I saw them from the servants' passage where Alexander had hidden me." Elena's composure cracked slightly, revealing the fear beneath her royal training. "They didn't hurt him, but they definitely weren't palace guards. They moved like professional killers." The situation was worse than Marcus had imagined.
King Robert hadn't waited for midnight or morning or any pretense of accident.
He'd acted decisively to remove Alexander from the palace, probably taking him somewhere secure where his death could be arranged without witnesses or complications.
"How long have you been in the palace?" Marcus asked.
"Since yesterday evening. I came through the mountain pass with just 2 guards, leaving my main retinue behind as Alexander requested. My men are hidden in the village, waiting for word from me."
Marcus processed this information quickly.
Elena's presence meant she was likely targeted for elimination as well, but her guards in the village represented potential allies. 2 experienced soldiers couldn't match the palace guard in numbers, but they might provide the edge needed for a rescue attempt.
"Your Highness, what exactly did Alexander discover about his birth?" Elena pulled a folded paper from her cloak. "He sent me this letter a week ago. It contains copies of documents he found in the palace archives."
Marcus unfolded the letter and read Alexander's careful handwriting by the light filtering through the window. The boy had been thorough in his investigation, cross-referencing birth records with physician reports, servant schedules, and even weather reports from the night he was supposedly born. His conclusions were detailed and damning. "Dear Elena, I've discovered that I'm not who I've been told I am my entire life. The evidence suggests that my mother never gave birth to a living child, and that I was substituted as an infant to preserve the royal succession. My real parents were likely servants in the palace, and my true mother may have been murdered to ensure her silence. I fear for my safety once Father learns what I've uncovered, and I fear for yours as well if this information becomes known. If something happens to me, please take this evidence to your father and ask him to investigate. The people of Valdoria deserve to know that their prince is an impostor, but, more importantly, they deserve to know that their king is a murderer." Marcus refolded the letter, his worst fears confirmed.
Alexander hadn't just stumbled upon the truth, he'd assembled a comprehensive case that could topple the throne. King Robert couldn't afford to let either Alexander or Elena leave the palace alive. Where would they take him? Elena asked. Marcus considered the possibilities. The Eastern Tower was too obvious, and King Robert would assume that Marcus knew about it. The dungeons beneath the palace were secure but too close to potential rescue attempts. That left the old fortress in the mountains, a half-day's ride from the palace along treacherous paths that few people knew. There's a fortress about 20 miles north, Marcus said. It was used as a summer retreat by previous kings, but it's been abandoned for decades. Isolated, defensible, and far enough from the palace to muffle any sounds. Then, we go there. Your Highness, with respect, this isn't a job for royalty. I can move faster alone, and you'll be safer if you leave the kingdom immediately. Elena's eyes flashed with anger. Captain, Alexander is my cousin and my friend. More than that, he's an innocent boy who's been condemned to death for the crime of being curious. I didn't come here to run away at the first sign of danger. You came here to verify his research. You've done that. Now the smart thing is to get this information to your father and let diplomacy solve the problem. Diplomacy takes time, Elena said flatly. Alexander doesn't have time. Besides, she added with a smile that reminded Marcus uncomfortably of her reputation for stubbornness, I have skills that might prove useful. Before Marcus could ask what she meant, Elena moved to Alexander's wardrobe and began pulling out clothes. I've been trained in combat since childhood, Captain. Not just ceremonial swordplay, but real fighting. My father believed that northern nobility should be able to defend themselves. She changed clothes with efficient speed, trading the servant's dress for Alexander's riding clothes and boots. The transformation was startling. Dressed as a boy with her hair pinned up, she could easily pass for a young noble traveling with his guard captain. Your Highness. Elena. If we're going to rescue my cousin from professional killers, we should probably dispense with formal titles. Marcus found himself caught between admiration for her courage and frustration at her refusal to prioritize her own safety. But he also recognized that she was right about one thing: time was a luxury they didn't have. A commotion in the corridor outside made both of them freeze. Heavy footsteps, multiple voices, and the distinctive sound of armor and weapons. King Robert's search had reached the royal quarters. This way, Marcus whispered, leading Elena toward the hidden panel he'd used to enter the chamber. But, as they reached the wall, they heard voices from within the servants' passage as well. The king's men had discovered the hidden ways and were systematically searching them. They were trapped between two forces, with no obvious escape route except the balcony window. Marcus looked out at the sheer drop to the courtyard below and calculated their odds of survival. The fall would kill them both, but at least it would be quick. Elena joined him at the window and followed his gaze downward. There, she said quietly, pointing to a section of the palace wall about 10 feet below and to the left of Alexander's balcony. The old drainage system. If we can reach those gutters, we can climb down to the kitchen level. Marcus studied the route she'd identified. It was possible, barely, for someone with excellent balance and no fear of heights. The drainage gutters were ancient but looked solid, and they did provide a path down the palace wall that would be invisible from the courtyards. You first, he said. I'll cover the retreat. Elena swung one leg over the balcony railing, then paused. Captain, when we rescue Alexander, what then? Even if we prove that King Robert is a murderer and a liar, the boy's entire identity is built on deception. How do we restore truth without destroying him? It was a question Marcus had been avoiding, but Elena was forcing him to confront it. Saving Alexander's life was only the first step in a much larger problem. How do you tell a 12-year-old boy that everything he's believed about himself is a lie? How do you give him a future when his present has been built on the graves of his real parents? One crisis at a time, Marcus said finally. First we keep him alive. Then, we figure out how to help him live with the truth. Elena nodded and completed her climb over the railing.
She moved across the wall with surprising grace, her earlier claims about combat training apparently extending to physical conditioning as well. Within moments, she'd reached the drainage system and begun her descent. Marcus followed, but his armor made the climb more difficult. As he worked his way across the wall, he heard the door to Alexander's chamber burst open behind him. Voices called out discoveries: the empty room, the open window, the obvious signs of hasty departure. "Search the grounds," came a voice Marcus recognized as Lieutenant Hammond. "If they're still in the palace, we'll find them. If they've escaped, we track them. King Robert wants Captain Thornfield brought back alive, but the others are expendable." Others, plural. They knew about Elena's presence, which meant their intelligence network was better than Marcus had hoped. It also meant that King Robert's patience for subtlety had completely evaporated. This was now an open hunt with no pretense of legal justification. Marcus reached the kitchen level and found Elena waiting for him in the shadows near the old well. The palace was fully awakened now, with torches blazing in every window and the sound of search parties organizing throughout the complex. "The stable?" Elena asked. Marcus nodded. Thunder would still be waiting, but they'd also need a second horse for Elena. Henrik would help if he could, assuming the old stable master hadn't already been arrested as a suspected accomplice. They moved through the shadows toward the stable complex, avoiding the main paths where guards would be concentrating their search. The night that had started with rain was now clear, which provided better visibility but also made them easier to spot if they were careless. As they approached the stable, Marcus heard familiar voices. Henrik was there, but he was speaking with several of the king's guards, his tone respectful but tense. "Haven't seen Captain Thornfield since his afternoon inspection," the old man was saying. "But these horses were selected for tomorrow's hunting party. Already saddled and ready, as ordered." Marcus smiled grimly. Henrik was providing them with an escape route while maintaining plausible deniability. The horses he'd mentioned would be fast and provisioned for a long journey, exactly what they needed for a ride into the mountains. But, as they prepared to approach the stable, Elena grabbed Marcus's arm. "Look," she whispered, pointing toward the mountain path that led away from the palace. In the distance, a column of riders was visible against the moonlit landscape. At least a dozen men, moving at a steady pace toward the old fortress. One of the riders was smaller than the others, and, even at a distance, his posture suggested someone riding under guard rather than by choice. Alexander was alive, but he was being taken exactly where Marcus had predicted. The rescue attempt would have to be perfectly timed and executed with military precision. They would be outnumbered at least 6-1, facing professional killers on terrain that favored the defenders. As Marcus watched the distant column disappear into the mountain passes, he realized that the easy part of the night was over. Getting out of the palace had been challenging but achievable. What came next would require more than skill and courage. It would require the kind of desperate heroism that men like his grandfather had died attempting. But, this time, Marcus wouldn't be facing the challenge alone. Elena had proven herself capable and determined, and, somewhere in the village below, her guards were waiting for orders. The odds were still impossible, but they were no longer quite as hopeless. The clock tower chimed 1 in the morning. Dawn was still hours away, but Marcus knew that by the time the sun rose over Valdoria, either Alexander would be free or they would all be dead. There would be no middle ground in what was coming, no possibility of retreat or compromise. As he led Elena toward Henrik's carefully prepared horses, Marcus found himself thinking about the last entry in his grandfather's journal: "Some duties transcend loyalty to kings." Tonight, Marcus would discover whether such duties were worth dying for, or whether they were powerful enough to overcome impossible odds and create their own form of justice. The mountain path to the old fortress was treacherous in daylight and deadly in darkness, but Marcus had ridden it countless times during his years protecting the royal family's hunting expeditions. Every turn, every loose stone, every place where the ancient trail narrowed to barely accommodate a single horse was burned into his memory. Tonight, that intimate knowledge of the terrain would be the difference between success and death. Elena's guards, Sergeant Willem and Corporal Hayes, had proven to be exactly what Marcus hoped: experienced soldiers with no love for political intrigue and absolute loyalty to their princess. When Elena had explained the situation during their brief meeting in the village, both men had accepted the mission without question or complaint. 12 against 4, Willem had said matter-of-factly as they prepared their weapons. "I've faced worse odds. Not against professional killers hired by a king who has nothing to lose," Marcus had replied.
"Professional killers die just as easily as anyone else," Hayes had added, checking his crossbow with methodical precision.
"Sometimes easier, because they get overconfident." Now, 2 hours before dawn, the four of them were positioned in the rocks above the old fortress, studying their target and planning an assault that would have to be perfect on the first attempt. There would be no second chances. The fortress was smaller than the main palace but built for defense rather than comfort. 3 stories of solid stone, with narrow windows and only 2 entrances, the main gate and a servant's door that was barely wide enough for a single person. The structure sat on a rocky outcrop that provided natural protection on 3 sides, with only the main approach offering level ground for horses. Marcus counted sentries through his spyglass. 8 men visible on the walls and grounds, which meant at least 4 more inside with Alexander. The boys' captors had chosen their stronghold well, any frontal assault would be suicidal, and the fortress was positioned to make stealth approaches nearly impossible. "There," Elena whispered, pointing to a section of the fortress wall where ivy had grown thick enough to provide handholds.
"That's how we get inside." Marcus studied the wall she'd indicated.
The ivy was old and well-established, potentially strong enough to support a climber, but it was also directly visible from 2 sentry positions. Anyone attempting that route would be spotted long before reaching the windows. "Too exposed," he said.
"We need a distraction." "What about the servants' entrance?" Hayes suggested. "If we could get one person inside, they could create confusion while the rest of us attack."
"The door will be barred from the inside," Willem pointed out.
"And probably guarded."
Marcus lowered his spyglass and studied the fortress from a different angle. The structure was old, built in an era when sieges were common and defenders needed multiple escape routes. There had to be hidden passages or emergency exits that weren't visible from their current position. "Princess," he said, using Elena's title deliberately to remind her of the respect owed to her rank, "in the northern fortresses, how do besieged nobles escape when the main entrances are compromised?" Elena considered the question, her tactical training evident in the way she analyzed the fortress structure. Underground passages, usually connected to natural caves or leading to concealed exits below the main foundations.
"Then, that's our way in," Marcus said.
"This mountain is riddled with limestone caves. If the builders followed standard practice, there will be a tunnel connecting the fortress to the cave system."
Willem nodded approvingly.
"Find the hidden exit, work backward into the fortress, attack from inside while they're expecting assault from outside." The plan was dangerous but feasible. Marcus had explored some of the cave systems during hunting expeditions, and he knew there were several openings within a mile of the fortress. If they could locate the right cave entrance, they might be able to infiltrate the stronghold without alerting the sentries. But, first, they needed more intelligence about Alexander's location within the fortress and the number of guards they'd be facing. Marcus pulled out a small mirror and angled it to catch moonlight, sending a brief flash toward the fortress walls. The response came within seconds, 3 quick flashes from one of the upper windows, followed by 2 more. Someone inside was signaling back, using the simple code that the Royal Guard employ for silent communication during hunting expeditions.
"Alexander," Elena said with relief. "He's alive and conscious enough to signal."
The boys' response had given them valuable information. The pattern of flashes indicated he was on the 2nd floor, eastern side of the fortress, and that he was being held by 2 guards. But the signal also meant that Alexander was well enough to watch for rescue attempts, which suggested his captors wanted him alive at least until King Robert could arrange his final disposition. "We need to move before dawn," Marcus said. "Once the sun comes up, they'll be able to see for miles in every direction. Our advantage lies in darkness and surprise." Elena checked her weapons one final time, a sword that was clearly well used despite her youth, a pair of throwing knives, and a small crossbow similar to the one Marcus carried. Her guards were armed for serious combat, with full battle gear and enough arrows to fight a sustained engagement.
Remember, Marcus said as they prepared to descend toward the cave system, our objective is to extract Alexander and escape.
We're not here to fight a war or settle scores.
Get in, get the boy, get out. And if we encounter King Robert's men during the extraction? Willem asked. Marcus's expression was grim. Then, we do whatever is necessary to complete the mission.
The descent to the cave entrance took 30 minutes of careful climbing over loose rock and through patches of scrub vegetation that provided minimal cover. The opening Marcus remembered was barely visible, concealed behind a curtain of vines that had grown over decades of neglect. Inside, the cave was larger than it appeared from outside, with passages leading deeper into the mountain. Marcus lit a small oil lamp and led the way, following the main tunnel toward what he hoped would be the fortress connection. The passage sloped upward and branched several times, but Marcus followed his instincts and the faint movement of air that suggested an opening ahead. After 20 minutes of careful navigation, they found what they were looking for, a section of worked stone that was clearly artificial, with tool marks visible in the lamplight. Elena ran her hands along the stone wall, feeling for the mechanism that would open the hidden entrance. "Here," she said softly, pressing against a stone that gave slightly under pressure.
"It's counterweight."
The section of wall swung inward silently, revealing a narrow stairway that led upward into darkness. Beyond the threshold, they could hear muted voices and the sound of boots on stone floors. They were inside the fortress, but they were also deep in enemy territory with no clear idea of how many opponents waited above. Marcus extinguished the lamp and drew his sword. In the complete darkness of the hidden passage, they would have to rely on sound and touch to navigate toward Alexander's location. One wrong turn, one careless footstep, one moment of bad luck would alert the guards and turn their rescue attempt into a desperate fight for survival. The stairway ended at another concealed door, this one opening onto what appeared to be a storage room filled with old furniture and dusty supplies. Through the room's single window, Marcus could see they were on the ground floor of the fortress, with Alexander's signals having come from somewhere above their current position. Elena moved to the door and pressed her ear against the wood, listening for activity in the corridor beyond. She held up 2 fingers, indicating 2 people moving outside, then made a gesture suggesting they were patrolling rather than standing guard. Marcus nodded and positioned himself beside the door. When Elena opened it, he would have to act quickly and silently to neutralize the guards before they could raise an alarm. But, as he prepared to strike, he heard something that changed everything, Alexander's voice, clear and defiant, echoing from somewhere above. "I don't care what my father promised you," the boy was saying. "I won't sign anything that legitimizes his crimes." A man's voice responded with cold amusement, "You'll sign whatever we tell you to sign, boy. The only question is whether you do it willingly or whether we break enough bones to make you cooperative." Elena's eyes flashed with fury, but Marcus grabbed her arm before she could act rashly. The voices were coming from the second floor, which meant they needed to reach Alexander without alerting the guards on the ground level. But they also now knew that the boy was being coerced into signing some kind of document, probably a confession or abdication that would justify his death and King Robert's continued reign. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside made the decision for them. Marcus opened the door and stepped into the hallway, moving with the silent efficiency of a man trained for exactly this kind of work. The first guard died without making a sound, Marcus's blade finding the precise spot between neck and skull that would drop a man instantly. The second guard had time to register surprise before Hayes's crossbow bolt took him in the chest, and he fell backward with only a soft thud as his body hit the stone floor. Willem and Elena dragged the bodies into the storage room while Marcus and Hayes secured the corridor. They were committed now, there was no retreat, no option except to reach Alexander and fight their way out of the fortress before their presence was discovered. The ground floor appeared to be mostly storage and servant areas, with a single stairway leading to the upper levels where Alexander was being held. But, as they approached the stairs, Marcus heard something that made his blood run cold, the sound of horses approaching the fortress at a gallop. Through a narrow window, he could see a column of riders in the distance, their torches creating a line of light against the pre-dawn darkness. King Robert had sent reinforcements, probably having anticipated that Marcus would attempt a rescue. Within minutes, the fortress would be surrounded by additional forces that would make escape exponentially more difficult. we're out of time, Marcus said quietly.
Whatever we're going to do, it has to happen now.
Elena was already moving toward the stairway, her sword drawn and her expression determined.
Then, let's go get my cousin.
The second floor was laid out as a series of chambers connected by a central corridor, with Alexander's voice coming from a room at the eastern end of the building. But, between their current position and their objective were at least 3 more guards, and possibly traps or obstacles designed to funnel attackers into killing zones. As they reached the top of the stairs, Marcus realized that the rescue attempt was about to become something much more dangerous, a running battle through a fortress designed for defense, against professional killers who had every advantage except the element of surprise. But, they also had something their enemies didn't expect: the desperation of people fighting for an innocent life against opponents who had abandoned any pretense of honor or justice. Sometimes, Marcus thought as he prepared to charge down the corridor toward Alexander's prison, desperation was the most powerful weapon of all. The sound of the approaching reinforcements grew louder, echoing off the mountain walls like thunder before a storm. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether they escaped with Alexander's life or died in a fortress that had witnessed too many betrayals and too much innocent blood.
Marcus thought of his grandfather's journal and the final entry about duties that transcended loyalty to kings. Tonight, in the darkness of an ancient fortress, those words would either prove prophetic or become an epitaph for 4 people who had dared to believe that some innocence was worth any price to protect. The corridor erupted into violence as Marcus led the charge toward Alexander's prison chamber. The first guard they encountered was stationed at the midpoint of the hallway, positioned to watch both directions but caught completely off guard by attackers emerging from the stairwell behind him. Willem's crossbow took him down before he could draw his sword, but the sound of his falling body alerted the remaining defenders. A door slammed open at the far end of the corridor, and 2 more guards appeared with weapons drawn. These were professionals, Marcus realized immediately. Their stance, their weapon handling, their instant coordination spoke of men trained for exactly this kind of close-quarters combat. Elena moved with surprising speed and skill, engaging the leftmost guard while Marcus took the right.
The princess's earlier claims about combat training proved accurate. Her swordwork was economical and deadly, with none of the flourishes taught to ceremonial fighters. She fought like someone who'd been taught that combat was about survival, not spectacle. Marcus's opponent was skilled and experienced, but he was also overconfident. The guard expected to be facing a single desperate man, not a coordinated team with military training. Hayes flanked around the combat, using his crossbow to devastating effect, while Willem secured their retreat route in case the assault failed. The battle was over in less than 3 minutes, but those minutes felt like hours. When the last guard fell, Marcus found himself breathing hard and bleeding from a shallow cut across his forearm. Elena was uninjured but spattered with blood that wasn't her own, and her expression carried the grim satisfaction of someone who discovered they could kill when necessary. The sound of hoofbeats outside was getting closer.
The reinforcements would arrive within minutes, and, once they surrounded the fortress, any hope of escape would evaporate. Alexander's voice came from behind the heavy wooden door at the end of the corridor. "Who's there? Are you with my father?"
"Your cousin Elena and Captain Thornfield," Marcus called back.
"We're here to get you out."
"The door is barred from the outside," Alexander replied, his voice carrying relief and hope in equal measure.
"And there are 2 more guards in here with me."
Marcus examined the door and found the heavy wooden bar that secured it. But, as he reached for it, Elena grabbed his arm. "Wait," she whispered. "If there are guards in the room with him, opening the door gives them a clear shot at us.
We need a different approach."
The sound of splintering wood from below indicated that the fortress's main entrance was being breached by the arriving reinforcements. King Robert's men were inside the building and would be climbing the stairs within moments. Marcus studied the corridor layout and made a tactical decision. "Hayes, Willem, hold the stairway.
Give us as much time as you can."
Both guards nodded and moved to defensive positions that would force any attackers to come at them one at a time through the narrow stairwell. It wasn't a position they could hold indefinitely, but it might by the time needed to extract Alexander. Elena had moved to the window at the end of the corridor and was studying the wall outside. "There," she said, pointing to the thick ivy they'd observed earlier.
If we can get Alexander to the window, we can climb down to the ground level.
Still too exposed, Marcus replied. The sentries outside will see us immediately.
Not if we create a distraction first. Elena's smile was predatory. Those oil lamps throughout the fortress aren't just for light. They're also incendiary devices if used properly. Marcus understood immediately.
A fire in the lower levels would draw attention and manpower away from the upper floors, creating confusion that might allow them to escape during the chaos. It was dangerous, but everything about their situation was dangerous now. The sound of combat from the stairwell indicated that Hayes and Willem were already engaged with the advancing guards. Time was running out faster than Marcus had hoped.
Alexander, Marcus called through the door. We're going to create a distraction. When you hear the commotion, get away from your guards however you can.
Duck, hide, anything to avoid being used as a human shield.
I understand, came the boy's voice, steady despite the circumstances.
The prince might be only 12 years old, but he was demonstrating the kind of courage that would have made his real parents proud. Elena had gathered several oil lamps from the corridor and was preparing to throw them down the stairwell. The ancient wooden beams of the fortress would catch fire quickly, and the smoke would spread through the building within minutes. Now, Marcus said, lifting the bar from Alexander's door. Elena hurled the lamps down the stairway, and the sound of breaking glass was immediately followed by the whoosh of igniting oil. Flames began to spread across the wooden stairs and up the walls, filling the lower level with smoke and orange light. Marcus kicked open Alexander's door and dove into the room, Elena right behind him. The two guards inside had indeed been prepared to use the prince as a shield, but the sudden appearance of fire in the corridor below had distracted them just long enough for the rescue to succeed. The first guard fell to Marcus's sword before he could react. The second managed to grab Alexander and press a knife to the boy's throat, but Elena's throwing knife took him in the eye before he could make demands or threats. Alexander looked pale but unharmed, though his hands showed rope burns from struggling against his bonds. His eyes were wide with the kind of shock that comes from witnessing sudden violence, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "I knew you'd come," he said simply.
"I've been watching for signals since they brought me here." "Are you hurt?" Elena asked, checking her cousin for injuries. "Nothing serious. But they've been asking questions about what I discovered, and who else knows? They have a document they want me to sign, something that admits to treason and justifies my execution." Marcus took the parchment from the room's table and glanced at its contents. The document was indeed a confession, carefully crafted to make Alexander's death appear legally justified while absolving King Robert of any wrongdoing. It also implicated Elena as a co-conspirator, ensuring that both young people would be eliminated. "We'll deal with this later," Marcus said, tucking the confession into his coat. "Right now we need to get out of here." The fire Elena had started was spreading faster than anticipated. The smoke was already thick enough to obscure vision, and the heat was becoming uncomfortable even on the second floor. But the distraction was working. Through the window, they could see guards running toward the fortress to fight the fire, leaving the perimeter less heavily defended. Elena tested the ivy-covered wall outside the window and pronounced it strong enough to support their weight. "Alexander first," she said. "Then me, then Marcus." But as Alexander prepared to climb through the window, the sound of footsteps in the corridor indicated that some of King Robert's men had fought their way past Hayes and Willem. The fortress was filling with smoke, but it was also filling with enemies who knew the building was burning and were desperate to complete their mission before the structure became uninhabitable. Marcus positioned himself at the door, sword ready, while Elena helped Alexander through the window. The boy moved with surprising agility for someone who'd spent hours in captivity, and within moments he was climbing down the ivy toward the ground. "Go," Marcus told Elena. "I'll hold them off." "We all go together," Elena replied firmly. That was the plan. The first enemy soldier appeared in the smoky corridor, coughing and squinting but still armed and dangerous. Marcus's sword took him down, but more shapes were moving through the haze behind the first attacker. Elena fired her crossbow down the corridor, buying them precious seconds. "Marcus, now!"
He dove through the window as crossbow bolts flew through the space where he'd been standing. The ivy held his weight, but barely, and he could feel the ancient vines tearing under the strain of 3 people climbing down simultaneously. Alexander reached the ground first and immediately moved toward the horses they'd left concealed in the rocks. Elena was close behind, but Marcus was still halfway down the wall when he heard shouts from above. The guards in Alexander's former prison chamber were leaning out the window, preparing to fire down at the escaping prisoners. A crossbow bolt tore through the ivy inches from Marcus's hand, followed by another that grazed his shoulder. He dropped the last 10 feet to the ground, landing hard but intact, just as more bolts rained down from above. Elena was already helping Alexander mount one of the horses while she prepared her own. The fire in the fortress was visible through multiple windows now, and the smoke was beginning to spread across the mountainside. "Hayes and Willem?" Alexander asked, looking back at the fortress with concern. "They knew the risks," Marcus said grimly, though he hoped the 2 guards had found their own way out of the burning building. They rode hard down the mountain path, pushing their horses to dangerous speeds on terrain that was treacherous even in daylight. Behind them, the fortress burned like a beacon against the night sky, and the shouts of King Robert's men echoed off the mountain walls. But they were free, at least for now. Alexander was alive, Elena was safe, and they had evidence that could expose King Robert's crimes if they could find a way to present it without being killed first. As they descended toward the valley where Elena's main guard force was waiting, Marcus realized that the most difficult part of their mission still lay ahead. They'd rescued Alexander from immediate death, but the boy's future remained uncertain. How do you build a new life for someone whose entire identity has been revealed as a lie? How do you protect a 12-year-old who knows too much about royal secrets and conspiracy? Alexander rode beside his cousin with the determination of someone far older than his years. The night's events had stripped away any remaining innocence about the nature of power and the lengths to which people would go to preserve it. But they'd also revealed the boy's fundamental courage and character, qualities that had nothing to do with royal blood or legitimate succession. Elena guided her horse alongside Marcus as they approached the valley. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "Now we disappear," Marcus replied. "At least until we can figure out how to use what we know without getting everyone killed." The first light of dawn was beginning to show on the eastern horizon as they reached the valley floor. Elena's main guard force was waiting as promised, along with supplies and fresh horses for a long journey. But, as Marcus looked back at the burning fortress and considered the resources King Robert would deploy to hunt them down, he realized they would need more than just supplies and fast horses. They would need allies, evidence that couldn't be dismissed or suppressed, and a plan that could expose the truth without destroying the kingdom in the process. Most importantly, they would need time to help Alexander understand who he really was beneath the lies he'd been told his entire life. The sun rose over the mountains of Valdoria as 4 fugitives rode toward an uncertain future, carrying secrets that could topple a throne and the responsibility of protecting an innocent boy who had already paid too high a price for the crime of seeking truth. Behind them, the fortress burned itself out against the morning sky, taking with it the last vestiges of a world where loyalty to kings mattered more than duty to justice. Marcus thought of his grandfather's final words about transcendent duties as they disappeared into the wilderness. Some secrets were indeed worth dying for, but, as he watched Alexander and Elena riding ahead of him with the sunrise painting their faces gold, he realized that some truths were worth even more than death. They were worth the courage to live differently, to build something better from the ashes of what had come before. The story wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But, for the first time in decades, the outcome wasn't predetermined by the will of a king who had forgotten what honor meant. Whatever came next would be shaped by the choices of people who had decided that some innocence was worth any price to protect, and that the most powerful weapon against tyranny wasn't a sword or a crown, but the simple refusal to let truth die in darkness.